I think we live in a kind of world that is riddled through with deception, but that's not the natural world. That's just the world of man, and that man has the propensity to be corrupt. But I don't think that there's a cosmic demiurgical prison that keeps us in this kind of web of illusion. I think what we have is a world that is an echo of higher realities. You know, this world is made in the image of higher worlds, and there are multiple layers or tiers to that. Really, what each individual person is kind of like an elastic band that you kind of stretch out from the one. The material world is the lowest extension of the soul into matter, but it can be released and it can snap back into that higher world. But we also have a realm populated by higher intelligences. Daimones, populated by gods, angels, demons, once you get into Neoplatonism. And in McKenna, of course, you have higher intelligences as well.
Since you are interfacing with this channel, I'm going to make a guess. You suspect that there's more to reality than what our senses tell us, more to reality than what our scientific instruments can probe into. You suspect that there's some sort of hidden architecture brimming with unseen intelligences, an architecture that leads to higher worlds. Ancient esoteric lineages like Hermeticism and Platonism concluded the same thing, and I suspect that modern consciousness explorers are stumbling into that same transcendent territory. Tying this together, the late beautiful bard of psychedelia, Terence McKenna, said, quote, "Certainly, Neoplatonism, that school, are psychedelic philosophers. Their ideas of an ascending hierarchy of more and more rarefied states is a sophisticated presentation of the shamanic cosmology, which is the cosmology that one experientially discovers when they involve themselves with psychedelics." And speaking of tying this all together, in this mind meld, I am joined by the singular Dr. Dan Attrell. And not only does he tie all of this together in this episode, he is a historian, classicist, translator of magical texts like the Picatrix. He's also the creator of a YouTube channel I have watched so much of, the Modern Hermeticist. If you are interested in these topics and you are not subscribed, you're going to want to do it. And I'm just going to leave it at this as not to blather on. If I was correct about the above, if you suspect there is more to reality than what we can see, that there are hidden metaphysical layers to the onion, that there are unseen intelligences just behind the veil, that consciousness is fundamental to the nature of reality, this one is just going to be bursting with breadcrumbs for you to follow up on, even more so if you're a McKenna head, as you shall see in due course. And with that, let's proceed, but first, please do poke the hidden architecture of this construct by liking, subscribing, commenting, sharing. I'm trying to hit 200k subs by the end of the year. Do sub to Third Eye Drops wherever you listen to audio podcasts. We've got a huge audio-only back catalog with just many, many brilliant beings. And we have got a growing library of YouTube members-only content. In the members section, you can also get the same content and more by joining up at patreon.com/Third Eye Drops, like a patron-only Discord server, along with physical rewards like stickers, pins, shirts, and more, depending on your initiation level. And speaking of initiations, I am elated to initiate this mind meld with the brilliant Dr. Dan Attrell. It is an honor, truly, to have you in the mind meld. I'm going to publicly bathe you in compliments for a moment, because like I said before we start recording, you really are such an intellectual inspiration, creative inspiration. I wish my brain worked like your brain. For people that don't know, you're becoming really a world expert on esoteric texts and Western esotericism. So yeah, I could go on, but thank you, man. Thank you for what you're doing and all the unseen work that I know you're putting in.
Well, thanks for having me, Michael, and I'm really happy to be here. Just another one of your esteemed guests. I mean, you got a lot of great guests, so I'm happy to join the ranks of those guests, and I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Yeah, man, absolutely. Yeah, you know, one of the things I've been exploring broadly on the channel is just this like strange collision of ancient and modern ideas. And like I mentioned, you really are an elite level expert in ancient esoteric stuff. Like you were one of the primary translators of the Picatrix. And for people that we'll probably talk more about this throughout the conversation, just because this is something you've spent so much time on. But for people that don't know about these texts, they're just replete with like uh, planetary intelligences, angels, daimons, spirits, strange hidden symbols and words and workings to contact these things, these intelligences. And to me, as someone who's interested in that and the more modern manifestations of these things, it's hard not to just want to juxtapose it a little bit against what is in the zeitgeist currently. Like it doesn't seem far from simulation theory. It doesn't seem far from entity contact or alien contact. And I'm assuming, that the desire to do that has been bred out of you as a scholar to some degree. But I also have to imagine that personally, you must kind of like weigh these ideas in your mind privately.
Definitely. On both fronts, I think. Like, there is definitely a strong drive to look at things objectively and to situate things in their historical context, and to not try to project modern ideas about things onto the past, which are frequently colored by modern events. But you can't help the fact that you live in the world that you live in, and you see the world the way that you see the world, and that colors the way that you interact with these texts. But really, the goal is to try to see things as clearly from the perspective of someone who lived in a different world. The past is another country. People in the past are very foreign to us, just in the way that somebody from a different culture speaking a different language is very foreign to us. So what I try to do is see the world through their eyes. But you're right, I can't help but bring in those connections, and those are usually things that are reserved for private musings or things like that, because you don't want to speculate too much and go down a kind of wild rabbit chase. And then next thing you know, you're not actually looking at history. You're just kind of doing auto psychologizing, or a kind of
Yeah.
autobiography, if you will. I think this was something that's explored in the book Nausea by Sartre,
Hmm.
where he's doing historical research on this count from, I think, the 18th century. And he realizes through his historical research that he's not actually researching the past at all. He's just doing a kind of autobiography of himself and
Yeah.
projecting himself into his subject. And
Yeah.
so we always have to be cautious of that. And there's only so much you can mitigate it, but that's a big part of historicizing, dealing with things in their contexts, and that's what I try to do.
Yeah.
So my focus, as you know, on my channel, has been primarily dredging up the primary sources, or at least translations of primary sources, and presenting those to people, because often people's um, their interaction with these ancient ideas are often through the lens of modern authors, whether that be someone like Jung or Terence
Yeah.
McKenna or Crowley, or any number of modern 20th century thinkers. They are kind of like relay points through which we look at the past. But what we find when we look at the past is that sometimes we want it to say something. We want it to appear a certain way, or we expect it to say something, and the texts don't bear that out. And so that's where I come in. My approach to these things is primarily linguistic. My training is in languages, especially in ancient and medieval and Renaissance Latin. So that's my focus: is Latin Hermetica, Latin Kabbalah, and Latin magical texts. So those are the things that I've worked on most closely. But my angle primarily is linguistic, really. So that's my training. That's how I come at this stuff, is from a kind of academic lens focused on philology and
Hmm.
texts.
Yeah.
Um,
Heard and totally respected. Yet I'm still gonna bring you down some of these speculative rabbit holes because they're too fun, and you're too
that's
much of
okay.
an expert in these things that I'm so deeply interested in. And for some reason, this is coming to mind right now. I think. Do you know Earl from Secret History of Western Esotericism?
Yes, I mean, I'm a huge fan of the show,
Me
and
too.
I've met him once or twice online through conferences. So I've spoken to him briefly, but so he may not remember me personally. But
Oh, I'm
yeah,
sure he knows
I'm a
who you are.
huge fan of his show, and a friend of many of his guests as well. So it's a great show. You know, part of why I stopped or didn't really pick up Encyclopedia Hermetica again was because I saw the work that he was doing, and I was like, you know
Really?
what, he's doing a better job. Like I was intending on doing this kind of chronological romp through the history of Western esotericism, but he was getting guests who specialize on those
Hmm.
individual areas. And those specialists simply know far more than I could know as a non specialist in those particular areas.
Yes, yes. Totally echo everything you said. I love his show. Just like everything I was saying about you, all of the same stuff pertains to him. Earl, if that's his real I don't know if that I get the sense it's not his real name, but maybe it is. I don't know. But I did speak with him on the show as well, maybe like a year ago. Very similar situation to yourself, where it was like, he's just super busy, hard to pin him down. Finally got him on the show. But, I think I brought him up because I think it was through him I heard this idea of lumpers and splitters, that there are people
Yes.
who approach this material and they have this innate just need to either find the sort of golden thread of timeless wisdom that goes throughout all of these things, or they do this strict scholarly chopping where they just turn off that part of themselves and they just present it like it's as close to like a mathematical equation that just is what it is, uncorrupted from its ancient form. And I feel like for someone like you, that clearly the vibe that I get is that yes, you're a scholar, but you're also a seeker. That's the vibe I get from Earl as well. So it almost like your work just betrays that seeking instinct underneath the surface of the rigor, which is what I love about both you and him. And that golden thing underneath it all is what I'm just so deeply interested in. And it just seems like, no matter what tradition we're talking about, you can feel the quintessence of that thing reaching through history in all of these like multi-threaded ways. And some of these ways get corrupted, and some of these ways I think retain the core idea. And what I'm interested in, of course, are these things that retain the core ideas, that retain that unspeakable revelatory truth that we all just like feel deep down in our gut when we read it. And that's why I'm so into Platonism and Hermeticism, because they broadly feel like these traditions that were keeping that flame, and when I read excerpts from something like the Picatrix, I'm just like, man, like this really feels to me like people who were using all the knowledge and technica of their age to try to reach that transcendent other. Um, and I think the reason I brought up that juxtaposition isn't just because the audience is familiar with these things, but because I feel like in its purest form, that's still going on in these strains. Like people are trying to find the harmonies and how these things sort of reskin themselves in a modern context through, maybe it's more technological looking things, or maybe it's through more esoteric looking things. But whatever it is, I feel like there is a there, but of course, talking about it responsibly is so difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because a lot of the time, well, it's difficult to say what we are alluding to, right? Because we're
Right.
not necessarily alluding always to the same thing. We're alluding to a kind of network of thought that
Yes.
has expressed itself in different ways in different places. And sometimes there are overlaps, and those things can coalesce around ideas like the immortality of the soul. but not always. Or sometimes about the monadic element of reality, but not always. Um, and so you start to look at all of these different components of what we would consider perennial truth. And we see that sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not there, or like they're conspicuously absent. And sometimes there are tensions at work. So Hermeticism is example A, in how you have a kind of dualistic Hermeticism and a kind of monistic Hermeticism. And some people have tried to organize them in a kind of initiatic ladder, moving from, let's say, the body denying dualism to the kind of monistic worldview. But really, what we have is a bunch of different texts written by different people, and that they are brought into one collection by some Christian monk at some point. And there are some threads that we can see similarity, and then there are others that we see difference. And so we need to be conscious of the differences when we're trying to highlight the similarities,
Hmm.
um, because we don't know how important those differences or particularities are to the people who believe these things. So I think of like Porphyry and Iamblichus,
Yeah,
both Neoplatonic philosophers. If we can call Porphyry a Neoplatonic philosopher, some people have pushed back against that idea, but very different ideas about how things work. And
right.
so, and they come from different backgrounds. They have different educational lineages, and they draw on different cultural traditions. But nevertheless, they're trying to pin down the truth. And so that's something that I think is worth bearing in mind, is that
Totally.
we look for this golden thread of perennial truth, but we have to realize that um, we need to also look at the differences between how all these different people have dealt with these truths, or how they've manifested to different people.
Yeah.
Because I'm sure
Yeah.
that, you know, John Dee does not have the same experience as Proclus, does not have the same experience as Plato himself, or as Zarathustra, or what have you. But yet we
Well,
have this
yeah.
historical lineage that chains them all together around certain perennial truths.
Well, yeah, and that's actually a really interesting example, juxtaposing someone like John Dee against somebody like Proclus, who's like this, late Platonist philosopher who's also taking up this practice, this mysterious practice of theurgy, which seems to be, first expounded by Iamblichus that we know of, to my knowledge. Correct me if I'm wrong. But for people that don't know, this is this,
I think Chaldean oracles is our first
yeah,
um, window into the theurgical mindset. But
yeah.
there's
And I
a
would
big part of
love to talk
theurgy
to you.
that's
Yeah,
just pagan ritual, right? Like,
sure. I'm so tempted to go down the Chaldean oracles rabbit hole, because to me that is one of the most tantalizing, just interesting ones. But it's fairly niche, so I'm going to resist that
yeah.
urge, at least for now in the conversation. But
Well, and there's
what
so
that,
many translations of it. Like, even
yeah,
on my own channel, I have two different readings of it, and they're quite different.
yeah, so trippy, so interesting, so just like mind blowingly difficult to understand, like what it is that they're even trying to explain or convey. But this is also another interesting example of what I was just going to say, is that whether it is D, or it's someone like Proclus, or it's whoever these people are who wrote the Chaldean oracles, they are trying to, or like somebody from the Hermetic corpus, they're trying to, in some cases at least, explain what it is like to have contact with the numinous. And they do it in different ways. Like if you're reading it in an ancient Hellenic context, it's going to be in like poetic hexameter. And if you read
mhm.
it through John Dee, it's like contact with these apocalyptic angel intelligences speaking in a weird language. But or if you're a modern seeker, right, you're a modern psychonaut, ritual magic practitioner, meditator, whatever it is, you're doing the same thing. And what I'm always interested in is like, what, if anything, is the common nucleus? So I guess it's safe to say that I'm one of these lumpers. Um, the common nucleus of those experiences. Is there one? Or is it like we're circling it like this phantom that doesn't exist because of some kind of just human existential need or something? Like I, I've gotten to that kind of numinous territory a few times in my life, but it doesn't show up just because you want it to. And it doesn't show up just because you take a certain molecule. It's like something, some unknowable thing
Yeah.
needs to happen. Like
I,
I don't, maybe it's in the stars, maybe it's like maybe it's because you didn't eat that day or something and you stumbled into it. But yeah, it's there's something there. But again, talking about it is just so difficult, and it wears
yes.
so many different masks throughout history.
Well, the common denominator is the encounter of the sacred. And what
Yeah.
sacred means is set apart or cut off from the rest of everyday, regular, humdrum reality. So you often get people say, like, oh, everything is sacred. All life is sacred. Every day is sacred. Well, it's like, yeah, okay. But in one sense, that it is holy and worthy of dignity and that kind of thing. But the sense is that the sacred is something that is set apart from your everyday humdrum existence. And I think that all of these different philosophers, they're all trying to encounter the sacred, but how they do it differs. Some go up to the sacred, some bring the sacred down to earth, some recognize that they have always been there.
Yeah.
You think of like the ascended versus the undescended
Mm-hmm,
intellect,
mm-hmm.
which is a big issue of contention between Plotinus and
Yes.
Iamblichus.
Yes.
So that's a huge tradition in the Platonic tradition, or a dichotomy in the Platonic tradition. But ultimately, what these people are trying to do is encounter the sacred, the divine, the numinous, and then whether they are going up to get it or bringing it down, or there are many different ways that people try to do that. And so I think that's the point of commonality. It might be too simplistic to frame it that way, because who doesn't want to encounter the sacred, right?
Yeah.
And some people do it through visionary states, but visionary states are also quite common. You don't have to be a shaman to have one. Little old ladies praying in church in Eastern Europe have these experiences. So it's complicated by that fact. So then it's not about experiencing the numinous. At a certain point, it becomes about conveying the experience of the numinous. That's when you
Yeah.
get into the realms of poetry or of ritual magic or of kind of initiatic traditions where they are attempting to teach something that realistically can only be experienced. It can't really be taught. And that's where the mysteries come into play, or at least all the ancient mystery religions. They didn't teach you anything, they didn't have a doctrine. They had an experience that they wanted to hold your hand and pull you through those experiences. But at the end, there wasn't this kind of there wasn't a doctrine. Maybe there might have been a doctrine that you would realize when you went through these experiences. So something like, I live and then I die and I'll live again. That might be the experience that was received. So the immortality of the soul. It's a very
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
common experience, or this like, but some people don't experience that, right? We think of the soul as this kind of like irreducible unit of individuality that is immortal, but it's divine. But some people, they want to extinguish the soul in a certain way
Right.
and kind of meld back into the one
Yeah.
or into the divine. So do they, like in Christian Platonism, do they go back as immortal souls to dwell in the throne room of God with all the angels, with all the other spirits and divine beings kind of singing holy, holy, holy as they circle the throne of God? Or are they fully annihilated and absorbed into that reality?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
This was a big debate in the Middle Ages, uh, between, let's say, Averroism and the kind of Platonism that Ficino would
Mm.
resurrect. Ficino very much thought that the universities had been taken over by Averroism and this idea that we're going to dissolve into the kind of
Mm,
oversoul, and all our memories and all of our experiences and all of our individuality will be erased, whereas others view the soul as uh, not so, as indestructible and immortal, and it cannot be just dissolved. It's made in the image of God. It is a god in a kind of
yeah,
way, and it will remain that way for eternity. And
yeah.
what we do in this life carries on into that world. So again, lots of similarities across various philosophical paths, but lots of irreconcilable differences. And it's interesting to kind of tease out the tensions between
Totally.
these various schools.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting dichotomy because it reminds me of that meme of like the sad guy on the bus sitting next to the happy guy on the bus, but they're saying the same thing. It's like the sad guy saying, "Our soul is going to cease to exist and dissolve back into the pleroma or
Yes.
whatever," and the other guy's saying the same thing, but he's happy about it. It's like
Yeah.
that is such like it's funny because I think most people would think of those as like Eastern and Western ideas, but they definitely just exist in the Western tradition. And implicit in all of this too is that like we live in some kind of either completely false or limited reality. And it is the job of the seeker to figure out how to get back to the truer reality.
Yeah.
So, I mean, obviously, this is a very Gnostic idea, and it takes on a more, in most strains of Gnosticism, at least, it takes on this prison like sort of existence. Like Earth is, created by this false demiurge. We're trapped here by malevolent forces, blah, blah, blah. But then there's this sort of softened view of that in Platonism and Hermeticism. Like, yes,
Hmm.
we are further from the higher reality here, but it's not because of any evil. It's just like the condition the soul has found itself in because and for Plotinus it fell, it descended for a shard of the undescended descended and got trapped here. Or for someone like in the Corpus Hermeticum, the whole line of dialogue about being reborn into does he say the logos or the nous? I can't remember.
Mm,
Gaining the noetic body, and the whole thing where he's giving the speech to
it depends which dialogue, right? Because
okay, but yeah,
there
there's
are
several or a
differences.
couple, right? Yeah, but there's this notion, this is an idea I really wanted to ask you about, is this notion of like Plotinus, it's right there, Hermeticism, it's right there, that there's like a kind of waking up into the higher world that one can do if one does the right things. You almost like wake up into like a noetic body or a non-physical body that is a truer version of what you are. It's like something that you forgot that you are, but you already are that thing, and you wake back up into this truer, higher self. Um, I want to ask you about that as a scholar, but I also want to ask you about that as like a seeker yourself, what you think
Right.
that means.
So, I mean, I would start by saying I definitely don't follow the Gnostic view that
Yeah,
this is a
same.
false reality, or that it is a deception. I think we live in a kind of world that is riddled through with deception, but that's not the natural world. That's just the world of man, and that man uh, has the propensity to be corrupt and corrupt things. And they weave webs of lies that kind of trap us in there. But I don't think that there's a cosmic demiurgical prison that keeps us in this kind of web of illusion. I think what we have is a world that is an echo of higher realities.
Yes.
And, this world is made in the image of higher worlds. And there are multiple layers or tiers to that, to those worlds. And that really what each individual person is kind of like an elastic band that you kind of stretch out from the one. And the material world is the lowest extension of the soul into matter, like an elastic band, but it can be, let go, released, and it can snap back into that higher world. How that is done, there are differing opinions. What Hermeticism posits is that piety and reverence is the cornerstone to kind of that awakening, or realizing that the all is one, the one is all, and that they are inextricably bound up with each other. It's not that the one is a false reality and the other one is the true reality.
Mm-hmm.
It's all real. But what the one demands from us, if we can even say that, is gratitude. That's what it says at the end of the Asclepius. Um, you know, Hermes Trismegistus finishes his dialogue in the Asclepius, and they have a communal meal, a vegetarian meal, it's
Yeah.
stated, and the Tat and Amun
Tat.
and
That's right. Yeah.
his disciples, they say, well, why don't we burn some incense? And he says, you don't need to do that. All you need to do is have gratitude, and kind of walk piously in the world, and that's what God, if you will, demands from you. And I think there's a lot to that. And piety takes many different guises. It's piety to your parents. We think of piety in the modern English sense as somebody who's pious is usually a negative thing. It's like a Bible bashing
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
person who's kind of dogmatic, closed minded, but in a very kind of holier than thou attitude. That's not piety in the ancient sense, which a better word would be dutifulness,
Yeah.
or
Virtuous. Yeah.
scrupulousness. Yeah, virtue, exactly. And the sense in that is piety to your neighbors, piety to your parents, piety to divinity, piety to your spouse, your children, animals. And a big part of that also, as far as the Asclepius is concerned, is the making of art.
Mm.
Um, it's also making children. It's very clear that the making of children is very important, but this could be taking the form of intellectual offspring.
Mm.
Um, and so it doesn't necessarily have to be flesh and blood children, but there has to be a kind of demiurgical creative
Yes.
aspect within
Yes.
man that draws down from the higher worlds, that looks up to the forms, sort of like the demiurge does in the
Mm-hmm.
Timaeus. He
Yes.
looks up to the world of the forms, and then he creates the world below. Mankind is also doing that, looking up to the higher world and bringing the virtues of the higher world into the lower world and manifesting them through things like art, through
Yes.
beautification, through they can also be through science, through medicine. It's not for no reason that Asclepius is a kind of disciple of Hermes. Asclepius is a Greek god
Mm-hmm.
associated with healing and medicine, but is also kind of a map over an Egyptian figure called Imutes or Imhotep, who is a famous engineer, architect, kind of government minister of ancient Egypt, but also a figure, a kind of culture hero associated with medicine and healing. And so, in the same way that Thoth becomes Hermes, uh, Imhotep becomes Asclepius. But but yeah, healing, medicine, science, the arts, all of these things are vehicles through which we can draw down uh, the forms that are dwell up in the mind of God, if you will, and bring those down and manifest them into this lower reality. I'm not going to say fallen or prison reality or anything like that, but
Yeah.
certainly lower, perishable. Um, and the lament of the Asclepius is that a time will come where people will stop doing that. People
Yes.
will stop looking up to the divine and bringing down the divine to this world, and that will create a kind of apocalyptic end to the world, which in this case is the world of Egypt. Bodies will choke up the Nile, the waters will run red with blood, and sons will turn against their fathers, and there'll just be no piety in the world, and that's a kind of cosmic catastrophe. And so we have to reverse that, and we need to look up to the higher worlds and bring that stuff down into this world. I look very negatively uh, on the view that this is a prison that we need to escape, and that there's nothing that we need to um, do in this world because it's a kind of fallen world. Like, we really just got to get out.
Hmm.
I don't think that's
Yeah,
correct. And I
totally.
think actually, I would almost say that that's demonic in a kind of, you know, supernatural sense, that people who often are convinced that they need to commit because this paradigm is not
Yeah.
for them. You get that a lot, especially in the psychedelic space. You often get people who they go too far, they get too far out, and then they've lost all connection with this world. They've lost all connection with family and with friends, with their polis, like with their state, their
Hmm. Hmm.
neighborhood.
Hmm.
Like, it's all concentric rings, right, of allegiances, and you kind of want to be pious in every one of those
Yeah.
rings.
Yeah.
Um, and so I really do think that there is a kind of demonic influence that would convince people to say that this reality is worthless and needs to
Yeah.
be escaped.
Well said.
So
Yeah.
I don't support that view at all, and I think that's why I gravitate towards Hermeticism and Platonism far more than I do
Yeah.
Gnosticism.
Again,
Um,
I echo just everything that you just said. I might as well have, like, all those words might as well have come out of my own mouth, even though you said it more eloquently than I would have. But yeah, like, so there's two things that are just competing in my mind to explore now. Is what actually there's three. What do you think it really means then to wake up to that higher self? Two, there's this whole interesting strand of Hermeticism too that is very adjacent to theurgy. And again, I guess we didn't really define theurgy, but theurgy generally means something like God working, and it becomes this word that starts appearing, like Dan said, around the 200s. It's really big with the core Platonic sages of this time, Iamblichus and onward, Iamblichus, Proclus, Damascus, etc. All speak very highly of this mysterious ritual practice of theurgy, which is something like drawing divinity down into yourself so that it can use you as a vessel. But then in Hermeticism, and in Platonism too, there's this very closely related idea of, like, these telestic arts, where you are literally doing some kind of magic-y thing to draw down divine power into a place, into a statue, into a talisman, into uh, whatever. Um, and admittedly, I haven't read a lot of the technical Hermetica, but it seems to be about that sort of thing, like these priestly technologies. All of this is just so interesting to me. I don't even know what to ask you spawning off of this. But third, I mean, this is a good opportunity. Now that you've brought up visionary experiences, psychedelics, it's also a good opportunity to pivot into something else, someone else we wanted to talk about in this conversation. So pick your path, my friend.
well, you mentioned the kind of telestic element,
Yeah.
and I think that that's a worthy springboard. So what we have in the ancient world is this concept of teletai, which means initiations. But what teletai really means, and so we call it initiations, but that's almost sounds like a beginning
Hmm.
thing. What your telos is, of course, is the end point, and the teletai are things that bring about perfection. They perfect
Mm.
man. So the idea is that we are born into this world and we are somewhat ignorant of how vast and beautiful and divine the world actually is, and how it's
Yeah.
teeming with intelligence and with intention and with divine will. And what what the initiations do, and this is what the mystery schools practiced, is these teletai, is they take the raw matter of man and they perfect them. So, it's like an alchemical process for the individual soul. So the Eleusinian mysteries, the mysteries of Attis and Kabili, the Samothracian mysteries, the mysteries of Mithras, all very different. They all take very, very different approaches. But what they have in mind is the kind of perfection of man. And you'll see that really echoed in ritual magic as well, where they also have this idea that's drawn from Aristotelian philosophy of entelechy, that is fulfilling your potential. Everybody, according to, let's say, astral magic, is born with certain potentials and born with certain things that they're good at some things and they're not good at other things. And no matter how hard they try to be, let's say you want to be a famous guitar player and you've practiced your whole life, but you're just not cut out for it. It doesn't matter how hard you work at it. You're just not going to be able to do it like somebody who is a natural and has put in the practice. Like, no matter how much practice, you're never going to beat the person who's a natural. So a large part of astral magic is the perfection of the magus. And it is often through figuring out what stellar influences affected a person's formation, figuring that out, and then running with that, and not fighting against the current. This is a kind of like Taoistic element to it. The story of the sage who tries to cross the river, or the fool who tries to cross the river, and he fights against the current, and so he gets dashed against the rocks. But then there is the Taoist sage who he steps into the river and he lets himself be, like, he basically loosens his body and lets the current take him. And then eventually he makes it to the other side of the river, but he wasn't fighting the river. And so he wasn't dashed on the rocks. Yeah. And so there's a sense of doing that that is connected with astrology, at least in the astromagical tradition. And that is how you bring about the entelechy of man, this kind of like perfection of your potential. So not everybody is born, we all have different strengths, weaknesses. We all have different genetic makeup. We all have different socioeconomical circumstances. So it's like doing the best with the cards that you're given.
Yeah.
And then really is like trying to provide value for the world. And I don't mean that in a kind of MBA, business sense, although there is some overlap there. Sure. There can be. But it really is like using your gifts. There's a concept in Christianity, which is the gifts of the Spirit, or the fruits of the Spirit. And different people have different gifts. Other people do not have those gifts. And you got to find out what your gifts are, and you've got to run with them. And part of that involves conversation with higher beings. So in the Picatrix, it manifests as the spirit of perfect nature. So this is like a spirit. It's very similar to the holy guardian angel, or the daimon, or the genius.
Wow. Interesting.
And it is, once you have this kind of do this ritual, the ritual of perfect nature, and come into contact with your perfect nature, you'll then know what it is that you need to do to bring that value to the world, or how you can go about drawing down the higher world into the world below, for the benefit of mankind, for animals, for the world, and for the gods as well, or God, depending on what your view is, if you're pagan or Christian or Muslim or what have you, since there'll be different opinions on that.
Can I ask what the general prescription in the Picatrix is to be able to do that? Is it like a really long, protracted ritual like it is in, like, Abramelin style, or what is it saying needs to be done to
it's not that long,
perfect nature?
I haven't memorized the ritual, but it involves going into a deep pit, or a deep well, or a cave.
Catabasis.
Like, it is a total catabasis thing, and it involves not torches, lanterns, and setting up lanterns in this cavern, and there are winds in the cavern, and it's very similar to the intro to the Poimandres. So there are lots of parallels between the perfect nature ritual and the vision of Hermes in the Poimandres, where he's weighed down with sleep as if he had eaten or drunk too much, and then all of a sudden you have this cosmic vision of the mind of Ra. This higher entity appears to him and tells him how things really are. And so there's like a cosmogony or a cosmology that is described. There are, avenging angels and planetary spirits. And now we don't know actually what parts of the Poimandry. We'll find out when the new edition of the Corpus Hermeticum comes out. But what are interpolations of later Christian authors and what are actually original Hermetic material from Hellenistic Egypt? So that's something that a philologist would have to figure out.
When is that supposed to happen? Is that deep in progress?
I'm not sure. It's been in progress for like a decade or so now. And if I'm not mistaken, David Litwa has done a translation of the Corpus Hermeticum in a kind of initiatory ordering. So the idea is that the texts are ordered in a kind of initiatic path. And if I'm not mistaken, he works from the critical edition done by, and I don't want to get his name wrong, I think it's Viberg. I've never met him, so I may be getting his name wrong, but he's been working on a kind of critical edition of the Corpus Hermeticum, because for the longest time we've been relying on Nock and Festugieres edition, which is a critical edition in some way, but it is not as critical as it could be of the manuscript tradition. My personal experience is mostly with the Asclepius. So that's where, like, because I've got an edition of the Asclepius and a bunch of medieval Latin Hermetica stuff coming out with Breppels probably next year. Like it's past peer review, it's being submitted. And so a lot of my attention is focused on the Asclepius, which to me is one of the most important works in the Corpus Hermeticum. But yeah,
it's
so
very
there's
readable,
a lot of work
by the way,
done.
for anybody who's like, not familiar with any of this. I think the Asclepius is one of those that's like fairly approachable.
Yeah. It's the most bang for your buck, in my opinion, for like getting the Hermetic worldview as I described it, of, everything in this world has a kind of higher divine numen associated with it. And then there are gods above that. And so there are kind of like, there is, the sky, but then there is a kind of noetic sky, and then there's a kind of hypercosmic sky, and these are different types of divinities. And so you want to draw down through those channels, those divine energies, put them into statues, in this case, or, make art and animate the statues. And then you're kind of living in this enchanted world where man and the divine live in a kind of economy that is harmonious, and filled with piety towards all life and towards one another. And so that's really what it's illustrating in the Asclepius. And that's more life-affirming, non-dualist approach to Hermeticism. And it differs from what you might find in other tracts. But I think, the Asclepius is the most bang for your buck as far as the Hermetic worldview is concerned.
Yeah. And so to not strand completely the other prong of the conversation I was alluding to earlier, this may seem like a hard pivot at first, but I'm going to try to do it gracefully. One of the ideas we had before we started talking was to riff on somebody we mutually appreciate, Terence McKenna, and how Terence McKenna is like a modified Platonist / Hermeticist. And before we go there, though, I think we've already gone a long way toward doing our due diligence to, a lot of the audience is way past 101, like what is Hermeticism, what is Platonism. But I do still think it, even as someone who considers himself very closely aligned with Platonism and Hermeticism, I sometimes struggle with nutshelling it because it's more like this suite of ideas. It depends on what Platonist Hermeticist you're talking about, what text you're talking about. But there is, I would argue, a common disposition under these umbrellas, similar suites of ideas and ideas about reality. And again, it's really difficult because I think at some point, and you could make a better argument for or against this idea than I could. But in my mind, it seems like there's a certain point in history where the strains kind of merge. And, with somebody like a Iamblichus, it's like you probably could call him a Hermeticist to some degree, right? He's talking about very similar things. He talks about Hermes as this common patron god of like everybody who's doing what he's doing. That's like a philosophical seeker, the magus priestly type guy who's on this seeking journey for wisdom. He says basically Hermes is who we all roll up to, everybody who's on this seeking kind of path. So if you did, before we venture into the specific modern manifestation of this that is Terence McKenna in a lot of ways, how would you 101 what it means to be a Platonist, to be a Hermeticist?
I would say it's probably easier to go with the Platonic route.
Okay.
Because Platonism then becomes a very dominant form of philosophizing in the Hellenistic world, which then spreads throughout the Near East and spreads throughout Egypt in the wake of Alexander the Great's conquests. And to be a kind of sophisticated, educated person is to have an awareness of what the elite philosophy is, and then to incorporate or see the parallels between native, let's say, Syrian, Chaldean, Egyptian modes of thinking, and how those can be reconciled with ideas in Platonism. And of course, you get this idea that Pythagoras, prior to Plato, traveled to Egypt, traveled to Thrace. He traveled around the Mediterranean world and came into contact with Persian magi and Chaldean astrologers, and that in talking to all of these different people, he came up with a certain doctrine or set of doctrines. There's lots of teachings of Pythagoras, and Platonism taps into that Pythagorean tradition to a certain extent. So in a way, what Plato is doing is he's giving an alternative view of the divine world that is not necessarily antithetical to the divine view of his polis, to the traditional gods, but that is almost above it, or that's not even a fair way of thinking
it's
about
like
it, because
more esoteric and tied back into rational philosophical.
It's certainly more
workings in some
universal.
ways.
It's not like bound up by the polis. The crux of Platonism is ultimately that first off, we are not just our bodies. Our bodies are we also have souls, and our souls are divided. There are multiple parts to our soul. We don't need to get into all of that, but that the soul is immortal. So there's that. And it is subject to metempsychosis, and souls are of a different quality. Some souls are better than others, or at least are more advanced, and all souls are ultimately on this kind of path towards reunification with their source. And the source in Platonism is the one, the true, the good, the beautiful. All of these things are wrapped up in one thing, if we can even call it a thing, that neither is nor is one. And so you have this kind of indefinite dyad, if you will, this one that is not one. And so, but it is also the good. And so the good, by virtue of being good, it wants to impart itself. It wants to spread itself around. If it didn't, it wouldn't be the good. And so what it does then is this one spills out of itself. It overflows out of itself. And this is this concept of emanation. And the operative metaphor they use in the ancient world is that of a fountain. So a fountain flowing outward, but never kind of depleting itself. Another metaphor that would have worked in the ancient world but doesn't work in the modern world is the sun. That the sun always emits energy and radiation and heat and warmth that is generative and good and beneficial, and it never depletes itself. Now we know that the sun actually will one day explode, and we're living, I think, on a third generation sun or something like that.
So they say.
So they say. But you know, we have certain metals in our table of elements that only exist by virtue of multiple iterations of supernovas that have created enough energy to create those substances. So that's the kind of proof that we're operating on as to why we're on a multi-generation or multiple iterations of suns, this world that we live in. But in any case, the idea is that the one, the true, the good, the beautiful, which is one thing, but which is one, but neither it is and it isn't one, and it is always emanating outward. And this kind of manifests sort of like a mind that is infinitely thinking thoughts. And in that mind that is infinitely thinking thoughts, we have the generation of forms, of archetypes. And these are not just like, this isn't just like a chaotic world. This is a world that is orderly. And it also is trying to impart itself and emanate out and spill out, if you will. And so that's where we get this idea of the logos, which is this rational ordering principle of the universe. You don't just have pure chaos and accident. This would be the Epicurean or Lucretian point of view, that everything is just atoms in the void. Everything is just happenstance. And if things seem orderly, it's because we're in this very narrow slice of time where things seem that way, but they will all break apart and dissolve eventually, because there's no actual goodness or beauty or principle that's holding them together. It's just I don't know what the word is in English, le climat des atomes, the inclination or the falling, the way that, I think it's been translated as the swerve by some. It's just the way that the cookie crumbles.
It's like necessity too in Greek, right? And like the Greek idea of necessity, it's sort of like Platonists talk about necessity both as almost like a deity, but also it seems like as a device to be like, it's the way it is. Like it's the way it needs to be, should be, it is.
Right. But I think necessity is divinized in a way in Platonism that I think it would not be in a Lucretian or Epicurean atomist kind of conception of things.
Got it.
So for the atomist, for the Epicurean, the world is just atoms tumbling in a void and everything is purely accidental. This is not the view of Platonism. The idea is that there is intention, there is goodness at the root of all things, and that goodness kind of spills out of itself, and it cascades down multiple levels of reality until you get to the material world, which is the lowest extension of that goodness. It's not evil. It is an echo of the higher world. It's an image of the higher world, but it is imperfect. It is transient. It is full of generation and corruption. That's things are always coming to be and then falling away. They aren't just purely being like they are in the realm of forms, which is like the mind of the one that's thinking its thoughts eternally, and thinking thoughts that are then permanent fixtures of reality. Things like, we call them forms or we call them ideas. Those are synonyms. And often people will talk about archetypes, and those
Mhm.
that's also a synonym for form, idea, archetype. These are
Yeah.
all synonymous with one another. And so there is a higher world where those things dwell, and man, in his imperfect faculties, in the tomb of his body, is ignorant to those higher realities. But he can, because he came from those worlds, awaken to those higher realities, and he can, in Platonism, practice a kind of asceticism to strip away the kind of prison of the body, because man is locked in a cave, and this is Plato's operative
Mhm.
metaphor, is that we
Mhm.
are trapped in the darkness of this material cave, and we are forced to behold shadows dancing on the wall, and that is not the true reality. We need to exit the cave and go up and behold the sun, which is the image of the good. And yes, it will blind you, and you won't be able to sustain it very long, and you'll have to come back down in the cave, where inevitably people will try to kill you if you try
Yep.
to save them from the cave that they're in. um and so I think that is a kind of 101 of Platonism: immortality of the soul. The soul is part of this emanatory process out from the one, which neither is nor is one, but it is also the ultimate good. And it's the summum bonum. It's the source of man's
Yeah.
all of man's desire. Man might have desires for lesser goods, but ultimately those are just imperfect copies or manifestations of a higher good. And if man can just kind of turn his attention to the heavens, and here I mean the noetic heaven, not the literal heaven, although there's much to be said about that,
Right.
then he'll be set on this path of reuniting with the one. And this isn't something that happens over the course of one lifetime. If we look at the myth of air, there is this
Yes.
idea that people are reborn again and again, and they're constantly working on their soul so that they can go and be one with the divine world, with the gods. The gods are not the forms, are not the archetypes. This is a common misconception, that gods are archetypes. The gods are different things altogether, different category of beings, but they
Hmm.
they dwell. They are an image of the one, if you will. Each god
Yes.
embodies the one in some way, such that each god is a manifestation of the one, in a kind of web-like way. I mean, you get
Yes.
this idea of raindrops in a spider web. Each raindrop contains an image of all of the other
Mhm.
raindrops within itself, within that reflection on the outer edge of the raindrop. But so there's not just, or like if you shatter a mirror, you get multiple versions of the world around you that you can see in the mirror, but now it's broken up into many different shards. So
Yeah.
you can think of the gods that way. um, they're all the mirror, but they are fragments of the mirror that reflect the reality around it somewhat
Mhm.
differently.
Right.
But
Yeah.
they're each whole in that way. And so that's I think like a 101 of Platonism, and really what it calls for is the philosophical life.
Yeah. You just took it right out of my head. Yep.
Yeah,
Yep.
and philosophy in the ancient sense of the word is not just a set of beliefs. It's not logic chopping. It's not, doing mathematics or this kinds of thing. All of those things are philosophical pursuits, but philosophy is a way of living, and it's a way of purifying the self, to prepare it for this kind of encounter with these higher worlds. And so that I think is the crux of it.
Yes.
Uh, so that's my 101. And
Yeah.
surely
Oh
I
well.
could probably do a better job, or
Yeah.
somebody else could do a better job, but I think that gives us a good position to start from.
So yeah, so well said. And I think the only place in the Platonic dialogues where you really get a decent overview in a fairly condensed way is probably the cave allegory, because it does present the general ontology and epistemology in this cave metaphor, right? Like we are like these chained up prisoners in a cave who are looking at a false world, or at least not the false world, but a shadow of the higher world. You can escape the cave. It's very uncomfortable. It's not easy, but upward anagogic, whatever the correct pronunciation, um, effort is the task of the person who wants to know. And that, like you said, is the philosophic life. And it's how do you think about, though, you mentioned like math, it's not doing mathematics, it's not doing you know rigorous things with your mind necessarily, though that is a part of it. How do you think about the relationship between things like mathematical knowledge in geometry and this kind of higher science? Because clearly Plato was very interested in this. He had supposedly had that thing on the academy that said, "Let none ignorant of geometry enter here." Um, and coming out of a Pythagorean context, it sort of makes sense. But what do you think? How do you think Plato and Platonists were conceiving of these mathematical forms and geometric forms? Were they thinking of them as like emanations of divinity, like they were glimpsing at emanations of divinity?
It's that they are unchanging and
Ah,
perfect.
yes.
So, like, an equilateral triangle is always the same set of relationships. In any universe, a triangle is a triangle. We live again in this world of corruption, of generation and corruption, of
Yeah.
coming into being and falling away and decaying. But a perfect triangle will always be a perfect triangle. A circle will always be a circle. And maybe there are other universes where that's not the case. But as far as the assumptions of Platonism go, um, geometric shapes give us a kind of window into the forms, which, and geometric shapes are the sum of relations, like it's like the sum of angles. And so you can draw a triangle or you can draw a circle however many times, but it will never be the perfect circle. And so that's why mathematics is so important, is because you can know the correct answer to a mathematical problem if you were walked through it without ever having done the experiment, if you will. Like even a slave boy uh,
Hmm.
who has not been educated can be walked through a mathematical problem and he will come to the same conclusion that a lofty philosopher might come to. So the idea is this concept of anamnesis, of
Yes.
memory, of recalling. You don't actually learn things from scratch. You are remembering them from a time when, let's say, before the womb, before you were born, your soul dwelt up in that realm and in that world of forms, and it is recalling these things. And that is kind of the source of knowledge. And so, this is something that Aristotle would militate against
Right.
intensely. And, Aristotelian or Thomist philosophy, it is very much against this idea that we can just imagine the truth, or maybe that's a straw man, but of remembering the truth. We have
Yeah.
to use reason to arrive to certain conclusions. And Aristotle created the organon, which is basically just a system of how to reason. Prior to Aristotle, nobody had invented this system of reasoning. And so that's where one of these fundamental dichotomies arises between Platonism and
Hmm.
Aristotelianism. But we don't need to get too far into that. But
Yeah.
that's what the focus on mathematics is this focus on the permanent, the unchanging, the transcendental, the universal. These things are higher realities than the lower reality of change and of generation and corruption.
Yeah.
Um,
Makes sense. Yeah. The other thing I think worth mentioning, and because it contains some esoteric things that I really, really want to hear what the hell you think they mean. The other thing worth reading is probably the Phaedo, or part of the Phaedo, which is where Socrates, Plato's teacher, has been condemned. He knows he's going to drink the hemlock. He knows he's going to die, and this is where he gives um, the treatise about you have an immortal soul. It's better to die virtuously than not. I'm choosing to die virtuously. I've spent my whole life preparing for this. Like I'm ready. Let's go. But he also, this is, I think, probably the only place that I recall where he says specifically there is another world. There's another Earth, in fact, that is like more perfect, that this world is a shadow of. This world, in this world, the gods are literally in the temples. The people are more perfected, and this Earth is a dodecahedron. Like
Mm.
that's the thing I wanted to ask you specifically about, is like, what the hell does that mean? And I've recently seen.
I would have to read that passage
Okay,
again to
okay.
comment on it. But
Do,
I
do
think
you?
that the dodecahedron business comes from the idea that the elements each have their own
Mm-hmm.
geometrical shape associated with it. So like fire is like a pyramid and earth is like a cube. And this is an analogical worldview where the cube is stable. And that is why the stability of the cube is associated with the stability of earth. Um, and then you get, different shapes associated with, or the Platonic solids are associated with different elements, and that if you combine them all in some way, then you get this dodecahedron that is a vision of the universe or of all the elements. Um, I could be getting that wrong, so I would have to revisit this passage and
Oh
also
man.
look at the Greek, because there's
Yes.
so many
Right.
different translations, and you can't really know what it says until you really dig into the Greek. And
I think that's so often when I'm reading our bastardized English translations of Plato, is just like, I know enough Greek words to sometimes be able to glean extra bits of wisdom from it, but I far cry from reading it. But it's like, even if you just learn to recognize a handful of words, it's just like,
yeah,
man, we need like a sentence to explain
yeah.
one word sometimes, like
Well, and words,
sunthema or something, like, or yeah, logos, or any of these like even common Greek words. It's just like, my God, they're just so rich.
yeah. And knowing words is only like a quarter of the battle. Like
Right.
vocabulary building is one important aspect of language acquisition, but understanding how the grammar works, how the syntax works, how participles work and how they go together with their subjects, and like that is a lot more important. You also need to know your vocab if you want to read, but
Right.
and then you also have to reconstruct it by looking at use cases for words, right? Because words don't have intrinsic meanings. They have meanings that are agreed upon, and that agreement changes over the course of centuries.
Right.
So, in order to know what a word is being used as, you need to, like, okay, I need to look at 5th century Athens,
Yeah.
4th century Athens, look at Attic Greek specifically, and see all the other authors who have used this word in this way. And, like, is he using it in that way, or is he using it in
Right.
a different way?
Yeah, like
So,
daimon might be the best example of that, right?
yeah.
Like how many cultural accretions that word takes on
Oh, right.
over the
Well,
centuries.
accretions is another thing, right? So you think of the word daimon,
Yes, right.
obviously everybody thinks of the English word demon, but then you think of, daimonion in Socrates' case. What does that mean? It means like a little divine thing.
Yeah.
So like we think, well, maybe not you or I, or some people who are more interested in this, but they see daimon and they're like, little goat being with
He's
bat
possessed by a
wings
demon.
and
Yeah.
horns
Yeah.
and scary teeth or whatever it may be. Um, they're not thinking of a little fragment of the divine,
Right.
or this little divine thing that probably, has no material expression, or
Yeah.
it's not something that can be seen. It's something that is heard or that is encountered in the mind's eye, and has no kind of physical form. So yeah, daimon is a great example of a word that has huge semantic range and huge semantic drift across the centuries.
Yeah.
So we always have to factor that stuff in. There is no Plato 101, right? Like
Right. Right.
there's no dialogue where he's just like, here's my philosophy. There you
Right.
go. It is all dialogues where he is discursively exploring these different concepts, like, is justice real? Is beauty real? Like, what is the difference between physis and nomos? Like nature and law. Um, looking at what is piety, and trying to come up with these answers in a discursive way, or like the Symposium, which is all about eros, as being a kind of like, eros itself is a daimon that it
Yeah.
acts like a ladder, and it's an intermediary force that leads us up to the divine. And so you can't really sit down and read a Plato 101 thing, because he didn't write it. What he has is he's got this rich body of commentators, and a lot of them don't agree on what is being said.
But yeah, and this shines a really interesting light on what it means to initiate or seek or whatever, because part of the struggle with and the absorption of all of this stuff is the initiation, according to a lot of the more Neoplatonist teachers. Like, they always prescribe, like, you've got to read all the dialogues and you got to read them in this order, and then that in and of itself is one of the initiations.
Mhm.
um I also wanted to ask you, like, what is your opinion, like, or your gut telling you in terms of, there we get no direct pedagogical statements from Plato, or outline. We get nothing from Plato except a few letters, which are all disputed and stuff, or most of them are. But what we do get is what sounds like esoteric allusions to a lot of things that are not directly said. Like, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, I think the dodecahedron might not actually even be named. You need to, like, infer it through other
Mhm.
sources in, I think, in the Timaeus. But there's all kinds of things like this in the text. And also, there's like, you may have heard this or know this, um, from whatever's I heard about this on Secret History of Western Esotericism. There's like hidden harmonic and geometric structures
The
within.
divided line.
Yes, yes. And
Yeah.
even the whole
Like the
republic.
republic itself is mapped
Yeah.
on the divided line
Yes.
aspect, which is like I don't know if we can call it the like proto tree of life or something like that.
Oh,
Like,
wow.
it's
Yeah,
it.
that's a
I
good
mean,
point. Yeah.
it's
Yeah.
the line of knowledge, and like that at the height you have true knowledge, and at the bottom you have opinion and
Yeah.
sensation, and that most men live in the realm of opinion. This is how things seem to them, but we have to do this intellectual ascent to not just how things seem, but how things truly are.
Mhm.
And this is Plato's war against the sophists, who say there is no truth. There is only interpretation. There is only our perception of the world. Um, and we can manipulate it by manipulating other people's perceptions or their opinions. And then we can basically craft our own universe and our own world, and according to, how we perceive it.
Mhm.
And Plato that's his whole project, is battling against this and saying, no, this is, you know, I'm anti-relativist, I'm anti-materialist,
Yeah.
I'm anti this and that. And then he comes up with his doctrine kind of as set against the sophists, who were these itinerant teachers teaching the young men of Athens at the time how to debate in court, and how to basically, if you're living in a face-to-face society where all your decisions are made in big groups, then the ability to speak well and persuasively and to argue your case, that is like a world creating thing. You can sway the whole world in a kind of magical process just by using your words, and rhetoric becomes like a very powerful form of sorcery almost. And
Yeah.
Plato's saying, no, like, it's the purpose of rhetoric is not just to convince people of your worldview. It is to unlock the truth in people, or get people
Yeah.
to recognize what is true. And that's where the Socratic dialogues come in, where he asks all these Socrates is like a gadfly in the agora, and he comes around and he asks people these probing questions that questions their assumptions, and gets people to admit that they don't know what they're talking about. And then, of course, Socrates swoops in and gives Plato's view of how things really are.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, so and that's the philosophical project for Plato is getting out of that realm of opinion and moving toward the realm of truth. But again, it's a discursive process, and it's
Yeah.
something that you do over the course of a long time, and also ideally under the guidance of a philosophical master.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to ask before is one, do you think, or in the reverse order, clearly with later Platonists, it seems like something much more like what we would think of as like mystical initiation was probably going on. Like in a theurgical context, for sure, you had to be like taken under the wing of someone who would teach you these rituals, these techniques, whatever. But do you think back in Plato's time, because of all these esoteric allusions to things and like stuff that today we're still analyzing clearly, things like the Republic, and still finding new things like bound up in the layers of this text to a point where I almost look at these texts and think, is this a telestic phenomena in masquerading as a like a dialogue or something? And I don't know if they would have used that word back.
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
mean, it
like
was
so.
recognized as such by the later Platonists
Right.
that what Plato is doing is not original, but he
He's like
conveyed
drawing
in a kind of
divinity. Sorry.
he conveyed in a kind of sophisticated Greek, this kind of perfect Attic, which is funny because Plato's all against the poets, but he's like
Right.
one of the
Right.
greatest poets. Um, but that the ideas that he is riffing off of are not unique to him. They are ideas that are shared by the priests of the Zoroastrians, the Magi, the priests of Egypt, the Thracians. So that's where you get this tie-in with Orpheus, and Aglaophemus, and so there is an idea that there is a kind of perennial truth or doctrine. The extent to which that is true, I'm unsure, but that is nevertheless something that is posited. Um, and Plato was also initiated as an Athenian in the Eleusinian Mysteries. So
Yeah.
this is something that Terence McKenna put a lot of stress on in the
Hmm. Hmm.
archaic revival, which we can touch on later. But it's this idea that all of Athenian society were a society of initiates into
Yeah.
this agricultural mystery cult of Demeter and Kore or Persephone, and that they all beheld these beatific visions that made them no longer fear death after life, or like that they would live and they would die, and that they would be reborn again. And so there's a sense that Plato is giving a voice or kind of drawing out a doctrine from those initiations and from other kind of telestic traditions, and putting them into a dialogue that really what he's trying to do is create the ideal state. Um, and when you think about, so you have your immortal soul, and of course you want it to ascend to higher and higher states, but when you look at what the purpose of the republic is, to create the ideal state, it's kind of deflationary. I don't know. Like, it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, we want our state to survive and to fight off its enemies and to be the best possible, most harmonious state that we can get, and to have all the parts of the interior parts of the state ordered, just like a well ordered soul. So you have this
Right.
kind of fractal idea of like well ordered humans with well ordered souls conglomerating in a kind of well ordered city that has everybody playing their part and knowing what it is that they're good at and what they're not good at.
Yeah. Sorry to interrupt, but this is like another example, I think, of him doing something clearly telestic, where he's telling you if you want to make an ideal state, it has to be ordered in the same way the higher is ordered. I think he even talks about um like a higher Athens, or a more ideal city state, that it's like that is not terrestrial but is like astrological or astral or something, that you have to try to reflect down on earth somehow.
Well, the criticism against Plato often is like, oh, well, how would this work in practice? And
Yeah.
it's like, you're looking at this the wrong way. Plato is not
Yes.
interested in well, he may be at the end of the day, but he's trying to create the perfect ideal state, which is
Right.
kind of in the realm of forms. uh and whether it or not it works in practice, that's up to, how fallen man is, if you will, or how
Yeah.
corrupt man is and destructive he is, how given over to his bestial animal impulses he is. um if he is turned away from that and he looks up to the higher principles, he will see that the ideal is more real and more important than the in practice
Yeah.
of the state or of the republic.
Yeah. And early on in the text, I think, if I'm not mistaken, this idea of creating a city state actually only comes after Socrates says something like, trying to discuss like these soul matters is too abstract or something. So let's talk about it in a more concrete way. And then the first city state he proposes is actually this like Orphic, simple one, where he's like, everybody's vegetarian, everybody lives a simple lifestyle, everybody feasts together and praises the gods together and does rituals together. The end. And then I think it's Glaucon, Plato's brother, if I'm not mistaken, who says something like, well, what about meat? What about like, luxuries? What about all this shit? And then Plato's like, well, you don't even know, you're creating all kinds of future problems by even
Hmm.
positing this. But all right, let's walk through it. And then he walks him through like how this is like, here's how you would do it ideally, but it's going to just eventually take this downward slide into like despotism. And there's basically nothing you can do about it. And
Yeah.
so there, I think people have this like cherry picked wrong view of the Republic, where one, I don't think he was really seriously interested in creating a city state. He was using that as like an allegorical tool. And two, Socrates is like warning against it to begin with and talking about all these problems and like, yeah. So there's all of that to even make all of this super long, complicated text even more complex and multifaceted.
Yeah. I think the gist of it, though, is that the state should be ordered like the soul is
Yes.
ordered. And the soul, as you see in the Phaedrus, is tripartite. And it has this um, kind of higher portion which seeks the good.
Yeah.
It is trying to reach back to the one, the true, the beautiful, the good. That's the highest portion of the soul. And that is analogous to the philosopher kings.
Yeah.
And so that's like the cream of the crop of humanity. And then you have um the part associated with thumos.
Yes.
And these are things that like desire, pleasure,
Passion. Yeah.
or yeah. And well, yeah, the desire for pleasure is at like the very bottom. It's a kind of
Hmm.
sensual soul.
The Eros. Yeah.
And those are, street sweepers and slaves and workers and things like that. So
Yeah.
it's very hierarchical, of course. But his goal is to show you that, uh, the city needs to be ordered around this principle of the one and the good. And if we try to invert the pyramid or we try to fall away from that, then there will be consequences and probably will be wiped out by a neighboring city state who will just come along and find a weakness in us and exploit that weakness and destroy our state.
Mm.
Um, in nature rewards that appetite for the good. And if we seek it in all things, then we will have the ideal polis that we want. And so I
Yeah.
think that's really the gist of it. Um, is this kind of fractal vision of the world where the city is mapped just like the soul is, and it's this
Hmm.
clearly hierarchical thing. Um, and as we'll get into when we talk about Terence McKenna, this is a part where obviously he was not a Platonist. It's like very anti-hierarchy, very decentralized, almost anarchic in a certain way, and looked more to things like the rainforest for
Yeah.
a map of how things ought to be, rather than looking at the well-ordered polis or the well-ordered soul.
Yeah.
So I always call Terence McKenna a postmodern Platonist because there are certain elements that are very obviously Platonic and
Yeah.
certain elements that are very much not Platonic, or anti-Platonic.
Let's get into Terrence. So I mean he's somebody who's influenced me immeasurably in terms of my, you know, philosophy, just initiating rabbit holes, like, in his whole archaic revival riff sessions. He's talking at length about alchemy and hermeticism, and as McKenna always does, he's dipping in and out of, like a little dash of it, but then really just riffing on the things he always riffs on. And um but yeah, there are these core principles, these core, I would say, ontological principles that McKenna clearly recognizes as Platonic, but and resonating with his own intellectual interests, but also resonating with his mystical experiences.
Mhm.
Through heroic doses of things and smoking DMT, encountering these impossible geometric realms of higher, like just that scream higher logos, scream higher intelligence, are thriving with intelligences and beings that want to uh, convey things to you and convey knowledge to you in some sort of unknown, non linguistic, immediate transmission of knowing. And all of these things are very Platonic if you think about it.
Mhm.
Um, and he even, like I said, he called it Platonic hyperspace.
Yeah,
So
he's
yeah,
explicit in some cases.
yeah,
So, I mean, if you don't mind, I have a little shtick that I can give,
I don't mind at all.
and so I have some notes that I wrote down on paper because there were certain things that I wanted to get out of my head and make sure that I don't miss saying them. But so what I would say first is what I call Terence's Platonism is either weird Platonism, to bring in a little bit of that kind of Celtic dimension that he was very fond of. I mean, he's obviously fond of fairies and elves, and that colors his Platonism in a kind of weird way,
Hmm.
and we'll see how that plays out in different ways. Sometimes it's in a very Platonic way, and sometimes it's a not so Platonic way. But my general thesis on the McKenna question and Platonism is that uh, although he's celebrated as an ethnobotanist and a psychedelic philosopher, beneath the kind of futuristic veneer and the futurist rhetoric that he gives us, he's got this deep affinity for Platonic thought. And um, he acknowledges this himself explicitly in the Archaic Revival. So, and I quote here, these are his own words: "It's hard not to be a Platonist, but it's something that perhaps we should struggle against, or at least struggle to modify. I think of myself as a sort of Whiteheadian Platonist." So he's a big fan of the work of Alfred North
Hmm.
Whitehead, who I'm sure most of your audience, if they know anything about him, he famously said, "All of philosophy is but footnotes to Plato." And
Yeah.
I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think that philosophy is not just like thinking about stuff or having deep thoughts. I think it is really being in conversation with the Platonic tradition, whether you know it or not. And I think that that is a very important way to think about philosophy. But um, the so he says the central Platonic notion, that of the ideas, archetypal forms that stand outside of time, is confirmed by the psychedelic experience.
Yeah.
So he says, like, I am a Platonist. This is what being a Platonist means. I believe that there are archetypal ideas that dwell outside of time. Probably he would also say outside of space as well. But he then says the Neoplatonists, the school of Plotinus and Porphyry, are psychedelic philosophers. Their idea of an ascending hierarchy of increasingly more rarefied states is a sophisticated presentation of the shamanic cosmology that one experientially discovers when one is involved with psychedelics. And so he says it himself that he is a Platonist, although he thinks it's something that he needs to modify. And that's why I will refer to it either as weird Platonism or postmodern Platonism, because it's Platonism, give or take a few things that are modified to adapt to the world that he lived in, which was a kind of post-World War II world. He very much lived in the shadow of all of these horrific events that affected the 20th century. And so he needed to reel in or rein in some of the more destructive, or what he perceived to be some of the more destructive aspects of Platonism, but still kept to a core of fundamentally Platonic ideas. And so the key facets that I've highlighted here are, one, the primacy of the ineffable. So a huge part of McKenna's whole shtick was that, the world is made of language, but it also constrains you in a certain way. And I think he uses the analogy of like water rolling off of a duck. You try to use language to express something or to capture something, but the language just kind of rolls off the ineffable. And it's really, the bandwidth of human language is so low as to not really be able to capture or convey very much. And so he's always going on about this hyperspatial language, the language that the elves would reveal to you by showing you objects or putting jeweled basketballs into your chest when you visit the DMT space, saying, don't cave into wonder, or don't yield to wonder, because I'm trying to show you something. And if you can only just behold it and not give into wonder, then perhaps you'll come away with some deeper understanding. And of course, nobody does or can. I haven't met anybody who I'm convinced that they brought back the essence of what was in the DMT world. It's always just a kind of map of it.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Does he equate this with noesis? Because it seems to me like that there's something about that. I'm just thinking about this because it's like, that's noesis, right? Whatever you're experiencing in that moment, in that transcendent knowing, that's it. But then when you try to bring it down the ladder, the epistemological ladder that's presented in the cave, into a place where you can put language on it, it's not the thing anymore. You have to experience it, be it, to know it. And if he doesn't use that word, man, I wish I could have whispered that in his ear when he was writing it, because I think
he certainly uses the word noetic. I don't know if he uses the word noesis as a kind of process. He may or may not. I'm not sure. But he definitely felt that, what was beheld in the psychedelic world was this kind of firsthand experience of this visual language, or of pure meaning, like seeing pure meaning, not conveyed through words and symbols. But yeah, I mean, it does tie in, of course. It's like there are lots of things about McKenna's thought that have these echoes throughout Platonic history, and he doesn't use the same words historically that a Thomas Taylor or a Marsilio Ficino or a Proclus would use. He uses, we'll see, all kinds of, has different concepts of it, and that's what makes it a weird Platonism.
Right.
But when you strip away the layers of what he's talking about, it's actually not all that different. It's just the language he's using is different. So primacy of the ineffable is number one. And that's, the areton in Greek, the unspeakable. That is what the one is. Anything you say about it isn't true, because it drags the one down into the realm of intelligibility, and it makes it less, because the one is higher than intellect in the Platonic cosmology. And so to say anything about the one is to drag it down into intellection and make it no longer one. It can only be beheld or experienced in an epopteia. Epopteia is the visionary state, and it's the visionary state that is often associated with the height of the Eleusinian mysteries after a long time of fasting and walking 30 kilometers and sleep deprivation and sacrifices and being insulted by various passerbys who are trying to like mess with your brain and give you the feeling that you are like the goddess who's searching for her lost daughter Persephone. You drink the kykeon, and then the Hierophant rings a gong, and a bright light is unveiled in the telestrion, the initiation chamber at the Eleusinian Mysteries. And that's when the visionary state comes on. And so I think a lot of Terence McKenna's language and a lot of Plato's language as well, they draw from this initiatory language of epopteia, of having the visionary state. And so that's what I wanted to talk about in terms of the visionary component of it.
Mm-hmm.
But ultimately, it's ineffable, right? That's why it has to be beheld and not simply communicated by a hierophant or a sacred text or something like that, because it transcends language. And so that's the number one facet, I think, that connects McKenna to the Platonic tradition, is this one, the ineffable, the areton. But that's not it. Like, that's not, there are many, many other components that also tie him back. So it's not just this apophatic mysticism, negative theology that you see in Dionysius the Areopagite or in Proclus or in Plotinus. You also get this. McKenna had this idea that like nobody knows what's going on.
Right.
He famously said something like, nobody has a clue what's going on. Not the Kabbalists, not the Freemasons, not the the alien people from Zenebel Ganubi or whatever it is his favorite term for aliens. He's saying all of these people, they're like groping for the truth, but they can't possibly relate it in words because it is ultimately ineffable. That dimension can only be experienced in this epoptic state. And so that's a really important component of the weird Platonism of Terence McKenna. Another one is this obsession with the transcendent dimension of time, or kind of cosmological view of time that sees time as operating within eternity. Time is the moving image of eternity. And again, McKenna is explicit with this. He talks about the Timaeus, and he draws this idea that the demiurge creates the world, and he tries to create a moving image of eternity. And that is how McKenna conceives of time, and this will play into his idea of time wave zero, that history is this novelty producing engine that is concressing, experiencing a concrescence. I'm not sure concressing is a word, but in any case, and those further, like, ever more and more novel states are fundamentally going towards this universal attractor, or this transcendental object at the end of time. And this is exactly like Platonism in a way, because Platonism posits that all things emanate from a source, but they also return to a source. We are in this kind of state of procession and reversion. And so history, in the mind of a Platonist, processes out of the one, but it also is reverting back to the one over however many cycles of years. And then you get this of the great Platonic year, or this concept of the apokatastasis panton, the great renewal of all things. There would be a kind of conflagration that will basically return the world back to its initial state. And the universe is just constantly existing and creating new worlds upon worlds infinitely.
Yeah.
But
Before we go on, there's a couple just things I'm dying to run by you slash ask you real quick before we get too far away from Eleusis. This idea of the goddess being in this place sounds so, I think, impossible for us to imagine from a modern POV. But again, this notion of tying divinity to a place, right? Like that area you're talking about, the core word again is this teleste word, telestrion
yeah,
is like this like holy, like internal holy chamber where you could only go if you were permitted into the greater mystery or whatever. You would drink this mysterious kykeon beverage. And then the goddess would appear, and everyone says the goddess would appear. Everyone says the goddess was there. Wasn't metaphorical. It was like a real thing, that a who's who of everybody, not just from Athens but in that whole Hellenic world for a long time, went there to receive that initiation. um and of course, the side thing, and this is very relevant to McKenna, is the sort of psychedelic hypothesis about Eleusis. And this is something that it seems like a lot of people in academia don't love. It
because of the
seems like,
lack of proof, because
but
of the
it
lack
seems
of
like,
evidence, right? They can only
yeah,
go based on evidence.
yes, and
Um,
I think to a lot of people who read that, there's a lot of glaring potential circumstantial evidence, but it seems like lately there has been more of an effort made to actually try to find traces of like psychoactive matter within these ritualistic vessels, and supposedly they have found it. And I'm not like super up to date on all of this, but I was going to ask you about your opinion on that.
right. So it's complicated because it's the question. There are multiple questions, right? There is, was it ergotized
Yeah,
rye? And it was a kind of ergot derived lysergic acid analog. And so you get the book by Wasson.
yeah, Road to
Um,
Eleusis. Yeah,
yeah, The Road to Eleusis. So it's Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck, I
yep,
believe.
yep,
And they theorized that the priests had figured out a way to extract the kind of poisonous elements of ergot, um, and administer that to people en masse at the Eleusinian Mysteries. Now, that said, then you have Wasson does this kind of experiment. I mean, Wasson like LSD comes from ergot. That's how he
hmm,
discovered it. Was working on an abortifacient, which actually speaks to some of the dangerous elements of using
yeah,
ergot-based substances. Because if you give it to a woman and she's pregnant, she'll have a miscarriage. And so there's no reports of people going to Eleusis and having miscarriages. So that means they would have had to process it in some way. Um, there are easier, ways of thinking about it. Other people have posited, and I'm kind of partial to this one, opium, because we
hmm,
see depictions of opium poppies at Eleusis. So we have images of like friezes of the goddess who's holding wheat in her hands, but also holding poppies.
hmm,
And then there are serpents twining around her arms and kind of entwining the poppies and the ear of corn. And serpents are often associated with medicine and with poison and with pharmaca, because
yes,
the
right,
idea in ancient Greece was that serpents lived underground and they sucked on the poisonous roots of plants. They didn't generate their own poison, they got it from other plants
hmm,
and then they transferred it to people. And so there
interesting,
was this idea that that's why you get the staff of Asclepius is associated with medicine, snakes associated with healing. It's because you have this association between pharmaca, between drugs, poisons, tinctures, spells, charms. All of these things fall under the aegis of the pharmacon. Um, and the snake was a common symbol for that. So maybe there was a kind of nod to that. So maybe there was ergot, maybe there was opium, maybe there was both.
yeah,
Um, and so we just don't know. Maybe at some time there was ergot and then it fell out and then there was nothing. But You also get other mystery cults who get lampooned by the church fathers like Clement of Alexandria. So I think of the Mysteries of Attis and Kabili, where Clement writes at length that they drink a drink of gall. So just a drink of bitterness. I mean, gall is literally like oak gall or whatever, but it's very, very bitter stuff. And he says that, you've quaffed this poison and it's affected your soul. Like, you don't realize the damage you've done because you've infected your soul with this poison. And like, to me, that doesn't sound like just any regular old drink, right?
Right.
It could be that you've taken this kind of satanic communion and that is why your soul is imperiled. But it could just as well be that you drank the kykeon, or you drank this poma coles, this drink of gall, and that you plunge behind the veil, which is the language that they used. They
Sounds a lot like
became
ayahuasca.
Yeah, they became initiated,
Yeah.
and they know the mysteries of the mother, or they enter the bedchamber of the goddess. They experience a kind of hieros gamos, a sacred marriage. So like all of these themes are present in these mystery cults, and they're often associated with a specific drink. But
Well said. Yeah.
uh, the fact is we don't know, and so we want to think that we know, and we have all these kind of plausible circumstantial things, but there's no kind of nail in the casket, and that's what academics are looking for, is this irrefutable proof, or where it's a smoking gun, and without that you can't really make the claim. You can only speculate, hypothesize, and I think that's fine too. It's just we can't know for sure. Totally. But I think whatever they experienced, they experienced it after a long period of fasting, after a long 30-kilometer walk, weeks of ritual preparation, and like that. So this is an ordeal, and they're exhausted, and there are shamanic states that can be achieved through physical exhaustion. Talk to anybody who is like a serious marathon runner, or like a sprinter, or like a really intense weightlifter. When they do something kind of superhuman, they almost feel like they're bursting through into this other level of reality, where they transcend their humanity. So,
and out of body states, like natural out of body states, can be precipitated by that as well. Like it's like extreme exhaustion. Like there's a lot of people who, when they collapse from exhaustion, they perceive themselves as being out of body, or see their physical body. So yeah, there's a lot of possibilities. But I've definitely, even as a psychonaut, I have very much opened my mind to there being a potential on the natch explanation for these things, all the way on up to we really did have some kind of like technica magica, hierophant science, where they really understood how to attract divine energies down into a temple, and that was really a door you could open if you did the right preparation and went through it and were let in. Like, I think that's totally within the realm of possibilities.
And so all we can work with is the testimonies that people give. And because it was a mystery and it was unlawful to speak of, it was areton, unspeakable. You couldn't really say much about it, but you could say what kind of blessedness it had imparted upon you. And so we get people like Cicero saying, I no longer fear death. And that is analogous to what a lot of people say who come out of the psychedelic experiences, or people who are in palliative care and they're given some sort of psilocybin or MDMA kind of therapy in order to cope with death. And a lot of people kind of come to terms with death through the use of psychedelics. So that's always a possibility. And we just can't know for sure. But so McKenna connects he sees in Platonism a kind of echo of the Eleusinian mysteries, and that's how he connects it to this idea of archaic revival, because obviously the Eleusinian mysteries is very, very ancient. It goes back to the Iron Age. Eventually it was taken over by the Athenian state, and they had a family of hierophants called the Eumolpidae, who then their job as a kind of priestly family was to run the rites of Eleusis, and they received lavish donations all throughout the Athenian period on through the Roman Empire for expanding the site of Eleusis, putting more buildings on it, more temples, and really making it a lavishly decorated place, and a place of very of spiritual significance. So we get all that stuff, um, but to bring it back to McKenna and Platonism, I think that this issue of time really is a strong one, and that's one that you don't see very much about in the Eleusinian mysteries. Like, you see a discussion about the cyclical nature of the soul, perhaps, certainly the cyclical nature of the crops, and that we can identify with the crops, that the crops die but they rise again. And so that's kind of a seeing the self in the other, and seeing that the self mimics the other, or mimics the agricultural cycle, and that we can be reborn again. So there's all that, but the idea of time being the moving image of eternity is a really big one, a big Platonic element in McKenna's thought, and also this idea of procession and return manifests itself as a kind of concreting of novelty toward an unknown state. And so there's a kind of it's like the one emanating outwards, but backwards. Things are complexifying and becoming so complex that they eventually converge into this unknown object at the end of time that is beyond comprehension. Nothing can be said about it. It is unspeakable. And in that concretion of novelty emerges a kind of anthropocentrism to McKenna's thought that says that the human mind, we don't know about aliens because we don't have any proof of it, according to, he's seen aliens and flying saucers at La Chirera and all this and that. So he was not unfamiliar with the idea, but his idea is that, as far as we know, the human mind is the most complex organism. And so the most complex thing happening in the universe is what you and I are doing right now, or what anybody is doing right now. That is the peak of novelty and the peak of complexity, because nothing else is more complex than the human brain. And so he creates he divinizes humanity in a certain way, and makes it this kind of divine being that all things are kind of moving towards. And in that way, I think that's a very Hermetic kind of thought.
Totally. Yeah.
It's similar to this idea in the Asclepius that man is kind of the nexus of the world, that he ties together the animal, the bestial, and the angelic or the divine into one thing.
Yes.
And that really is the kind of center of the cosmos, is man. Now, some people call that hubris. They call it arrogance or human arrogance. I'm not so sure. It's based on what we know about the universe. If aliens appeared and we had objective proof, and we could, then at that point we would say, oh, okay, maybe it's not just humans. It's sentient beings are the most complex things, or things with brains, or it would have to be reconceptualized in a certain way.
Yes.
So,
and also what that also brings to mind is like the most cliche Hermetic dictum, right? The as above, so below idea in the Emerald Tablet, but also to tie in Platonism again, Timaeus talks about the notion of the human mind, the human psyche being a microcosm of the macrocosm, and they evoke this notion of like orbiting, going around within, the human mind, just like is going on in the macrocosm. They also somehow, this is one of those insights where it's just like, how in the fuck did they figure this out? They specifically say human beings are like stardust, like, or like they equate humans with stars. You know, the whole thing where like there's a corresponding star, but also I think they specifically say that we're made of star material somehow. So
Hmm.
yeah, these ideas of like the weird relationship between human human consciousness in the microcosm and then consciousness in the macrocosm. It's just all over both McKenna and Hermeticism and
Yeah.
Platonism for sure.
And so we can also move. So we have this anthropocentrism, but we also have a realm populated by higher intelligences,
Yes.
both in Platonism, which is populated by daimones, populated by gods, populated by heroes, angels, demons, a lot of it once you get into Neoplatonism. Um, and in McKenna, of course, you have higher intelligences as well, in the form of machine elves is one thing that he always talks about, which I think are similar in a certain way to daimones.
Yes.
And he also talks about the logos a lot, but I think that he misunderstood the logos, or at least
Hmm.
his understanding of the logos is not at all what the Greeks thought of it to be. Because for him, it's this speaking voice that you encounter when you enter the psychedelic space and you hear like the voice speaking to you.
Yeah.
He always associated it with an inner voice. So I think there was a maybe not a confusion, maybe it was a confusion, I don't know, of the daimon with the
Yes.
logos.
I was just going to say that. Yes.
Um, he always attributes to the logos things that are, in my opinion, daimonic. And the logos is just this rational ordering principle of the universe. It's like what radiance is to the sun. Like the sun emanates light, but the process through which it does that is through rays. And that's kind of like the logos, um, is the process through which the one emanates outward, is through this like rational way, not just this chaos of atoms and void that accidentally becomes orderly. There really is order written into the goodness of the structure of the
Mm,
universe.
beautiful.
Because again, it all is just one thing emanating itself as a procession out from the good. So the quest to encounter divine intelligence is the other thing is the critique of materialist consensus reality. So that's what Plato's cave is all about. This
Right.
and it's all about how our vision of what we think reality is not that great. It is conditioned by a kind of blindness or a kind of obsession with the senses when truth lies beyond the senses. All we have is these imperfect images or shadows of reality, unless we break out and we go into that higher noetic world, into the world of forms where we can see the good as it truly is, not just these kind of shadows of it. So, critique of materialist consensus reality. Um, and then the role of Eros is another big part of McKenna's thing. And he sees it as a kind of force of spiritual ascent. And that is like right out of Plato's Symposium with Diotima's Ladder of
Yes.
Love. She calls Eros a daimon because it is an intermediary figure, and it brings disparate parts together. It collects the scattered remnants of the
Hmm.
one, if you will, together and brings them back
Yeah.
up to the one. So he called it love. He even called it. He has this concept called love. Like he says it that way. He's like love, and he says I spell it LUV, and it's just this different kind of love that's not like lovey-dovey romantic love or whatever. It's a kind of cosmic love that binds all things together. So very Platonic or even Empedoclean in a certain way. I mean,
Mm.
there are ways in which Plato himself is Empedoclean. He sees the world as a kind of coincidence of opposites, well, of love and strife. Like that's the problem of the material world, is that
Hmm.
it is made up of matter, and so it's always attraction and repulsion and decay and generation, and it's always coming into being and going out of being, but it's not pure being itself.
Yeah.
So those are the factors, I think, that and another thing, of course, is this like late turn that he experiences towards alchemical and hermetic philosophy.
Yeah. Yeah.
So at a certain point, I think I don't know if it was 1991 or 1994. I think it's 1991. McKenna's in Hawaii and he's messing with the mushroom and has a trip that just annihilates him. And he is all of a sudden is struck with like a huge wave of skepticism about all the things that he's ever preached or gone on tour and talked about. So the time wave, the experiment at La Chorrera, which is a theurgical kind of ritual of
True.
drawing down the logos.
Yeah.
We're trying to
For
go
people
back
that
up to
don't
it.
for people that don't know, there's this period of time where McKenna and his brother Dennis, Terence and Dennis McKenna, go down to the rainforest and they just end up binging on mushrooms for a very long period of time. And for both of them, it's like this incredibly powerful initiation that manifests in sort of different ways for both of them, but is very consequential on what their life paths end up being. And there's all kinds of incredibly visionary, esoteric stuff that goes on, including, like you said, like UFO sightings. And Dennis has some sort of like really divine unitive henosis kind of experience where his consciousness just sort of like remerges with the cosmos and stuff like that. And yeah, it's
Yeah. And you ask Dennis today and he'll tell you it was a psychotic break.
right.
But I'm sure that in the moment it felt extremely powerful, and it was weeks on end of tripping. And there's a physical component to it too, where Dennis starts making this hum.
Yeah,
He can
yeah.
produce this weird hum from his body, and this is a kind of shamanic motif, either of producing a supernatural sound, or maybe taking something out of your body, like vomiting up an object or secreting a kind of
Yeah.
object, or having a limb that is gold, or there's all these different strange shamanic motifs where shamans will like throw up gems or jewels, and there's no way that they ate that, or like how are they
Yeah.
producing these things. So
It's like a
Dennis is
city.
producing this sound, and
Yeah.
then he's trying to channel the sound into affecting his DNA. And I think I don't fully understand it because it's inscrutable, but they're trying to use the DNA of psilocybin and like splicing it into their own DNA, and then that would usher in the eschaton, and bring an end to the world as we know it.
Well, I don't
So
want to. I don't want to derail this line that you're on, but now this is evoking another Platonic thing that is so harmonizes between McKenna and Platonism, which is theomania, right? Like divine
yeah,
madness, like that.
yes,
That's another huge overlap.
oh yeah, and the madness of poet, like, so there's the madness of love,
Yeah.
there's the madness of the gods, there's madness of poetry, and I think McKenna, being the bard, was very much the type of person who was in touch with that madness of poetry.
Yes.
And so he felt that very, very profoundly. But so there were all these things that McKenna was working on: stoned ape theory, time wave, the invisible landscape, the experiment at La Chorrera, which is in like 1971. So 20 years had elapsed
Mm-hmm.
uh, to get to that time period. But he has this horrible experience where he is just faced with intense skepticism and thinks that his whole life is a kind of sham, and that he really shouldn't be advertising psychedelics or preaching psychedelics in the way that he was, because he was like, oh my god, people could have an experience like this and their whole reality shatters and falls apart. And I'm the one to blame because I'm the one who suggested that people do it.
Mm-hmm.
And so he eventually starts to experience this turn towards, first off, cybernetics and like the internet and VR and this kind
Yeah.
of technological way of interfacing with psychedelic realities without using mushrooms or ayahuasca or what have you. And then he also turns towards Hermeticism, specifically alchemy as well. But this is not necessarily a historical version of it. This is Jung's alchemy,
Right.
Jung's reconceptualization of alchemy. And as far as his understanding of Hermeticism is concerned, that's taken from Francis Yates's books on the Rosicrucian Enlightenment, on Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition, and she's got a few other books. And McKenna really latches on to Yates's vision of a Hermetic tradition being revived in the Renaissance, and thinks like, this is the psychedelic thing that I've been looking for, where I don't see any evidence of drug use, but people are still tapping into these same states or motifs. And so he really started to go off into this hermetic and alchemical dimension to his work. So his talks from around the time of 1994 and so on, you get the Winter King talks, the talks about Rudolph II's court, you get the John Dee stuff, you get Giordano Bruno. He even talks about Picatrix at one point, because it's discussed in Francis Yates. And now I won't get into the whole Yates model of Hermeticism, because that's something that Wouter Hanegraaff has very amply dismantled, or shown that fundamentally he shows that what was new, or what was Hermetic in the Renaissance, wasn't actually magical, and like what was new was not magic. So Hermeticism had kind of always been around in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't necessarily associated with magic. So McKenna kind of runs with Yates in seeing Hermeticism and magic being fused together. But the Hermeticism that's reborn in the Renaissance is Hermetic philosophy. It's not magic. It's the Corpus Hermeticum, translated by Marsilio Ficino from Greek into Latin. And that really, and then Ludovico Lazzarelli also translates the Corpus Hermeticum, does a better job. And that opens the floodgates for guys like Heinrich Cornelius Agrippa to become involved with Hermeticism, and all these later thinkers of the 16th and 17th centuries. So what matters is that he had been primed through his kind of like weird Platonism, or his unconscious adoption of Platonism, and dressing it up in new language in different terms for alchemy and Hermeticism. And that really became one of the driving things of the final stage of his life, along with, like I said, VR, tech, internet, and rave culture. He became really big into raves, which was popular, I guess, in the 90s. And that fit the slot for him. So I don't know if he stopped doing psychedelics altogether, but he certainly started to explore avenues where they're not as pronounced, and where you can find this kind of psychedelic mind manifesting thinking. But it was in the laboratories of the alchemists, and in the alembics, and in the crucibles, and in old books, and old wisdom. These are the kinds of, what he was after was his boundary dissolution. And he thought that by absorbing these ancient tomes and this secret knowledge, esoteric knowledge, he was dissolving boundaries. And so he could explore the psychedelic without necessarily having to talk about LSD, ayahuasca, mushrooms, and so forth. So that really is the gist, I think, of why I think McKenna can be thought of as a kind of postmodern Platonist. And the way that he diverges from Platonism that's where the postmodern part comes in. That's where you get the archaic revival. And that is in his feminism. Platonism is profoundly, not feminist in its conception.
Although he does give women some probably good permissions for the time in the Republic. But
sure.
But generally,
of course. But like, even in the general idea that occupies the Western imagination for a long time, is that women are, according to Aristotelian and Galenic
Yeah.
medicine, deficient men. They are
Right.
ill-formed men. They are not different. They're different in degree, not in kind. And so that's an idea that he is trying to dissolve, because he's all
For
about
sure.
this
Yeah.
cooperation kind of community that you see, or that he imagined were around in the time of Çatalhöyük and the goddess cultures that reigned in old Europe. So he's borrowing from Maria Gimbutas, who was an archaeologist who worked in the 60s and 70s and created this idea of old Europe before the Indo-Europeans. They were a matrilineal, matriarchal, goddess worshipping culture. And so he's trying to return more towards that. So that stuff, not Platonic,
Right.
very much. And that's kind of one of the driving points of his archaic revival, is returning to that longhouse culture. And I think a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that, or they think that he's too wrapped up in, I don't know, Andrea Dworkin thoughts and the radical feminist ideas of the 1960s and 70s.
He's got a bit of an anti-natal streak as well. Like he kind of is
Absolutely.
like, we don't need to make more children.
Yep.
Um,
Yeah.
which, but I think I think his heart's in the right place with that, because he's talking about that from an environmental standpoint of like,
Yes.
we are just overloading Mother Earth here. Like we
Yeah.
need to just get our loins under control, is kind of where he's coming from. And in
And
some ways, not the feminist part necessarily, but in some ways maybe it's not that different from Socrates' vision of the simpler Orphic way of being. You know,
yeah.
like you should be simple, worship, like feast together, eat a vegetarian diet, be reverent toward the planet and toward the gods, and live a simple lifestyle.
Yeah.
That I feel like McKenna could probably get down with that.
But part of that would be managing our resources better.
Yeah, for sure.
And he was all often about dematerializing culture, which is a way of avoiding the kind of destructive habits of Western society.
Yeah.
But he also has this kind of anarchic,
Yeah.
or at least anti-hierarchical, pro-decentralization streak in him. And so I don't know if he would consider himself a libertarian or not, but it seems like he wasn't a communist, and he wasn't a fascist, and he
Yeah.
didn't really stand for like Republicans or Democrats or
No.
So it's like by process of elimination, you kind of end up sticking him in the bottom left quadrant of the political compass, which is
Yeah.
like this leftist libertarianism.
Yeah.
So that is very unplatonic, because as we've seen, Platonism is very steeped in hierarchy and not in these kind of decentralized networks. You know, who knows what he would have thought about Bitcoin and things like that.
Yeah, I'm sure he would have been into it. I think
Like
would have
maybe
been
he
into
might
it.
have even factored it into his 2112 stuff, or
Yeah, the 2012. Yeah.
2012. Sorry.
Yeah.
So there's that. The other thing is he doesn't see the body as a prison. He didn't have this ascetic streak about him. He had he was quite a bon vivant. And he was definitely more Dionysian than Apollonian.
Yes.
Whereas
Yeah.
Plato, I think, is way more Apollonian than Dionysian.
Yes.
And so when you look at all of those factors, those are things that I chalk up to the postmodern. The fact that he's living in the 20th century, him and his ancestors and his father and his grandfather and so on have lived through this time of upheaval and social strife and wars and genocides and environmental degradation, industrialization, mechanization, all of these different processes that come with the modern world, nationalism, and he's rejecting all that stuff. So he's keeping a lot of the Platonic metaphysics and then dressing them up in a different way, and then also modifying the parts of Platonism that he thought were this aspect of this male dominator culture.
Yeah.
And so that's my shtick. That McKenna is a Platonist, but of a very different strain and a very kind of modern kind. And I wouldn't put him in a lineage with like downstream from Thomas Taylor or something like that, but he's somewhere in there. And it's
Yeah.
really hard for me to think about him not in those terms.
Yeah. I would say in
Uh,
some ways he's close to some of the like romantic platonizing American poets too.
yeah, the
Like, I mean,
transcendentalists.
yeah, yeah. And I think, regardless of like the more political, social stuff, I think McKenna is directionally right, whether he's right about the history and, all of that stuff that you mentioned. I think he's directionally right, even more so than he was in his time now, because this air quotes meaning crisis, I think it's just like metastasized and gotten even more out of control. It's like we were already in a meaning crisis, like pre-COVID, everybody was talking about it. One of my friends used to be one of the co-runners of that Rebel Wisdom channel that was talking a lot about the meaning crisis and having these intellectual conversations about you know how do you make meaning in this postmodern age, blah blah blah. And I think we need these ideas more than ever because we're struggling to find these islands of coherence and meaning and what is sacred. If the and a lot of people are just straight up going back to mainstream religion, right? And
Mhm.
that's one route if that works for
Which
people.
also
Yeah.
encapsulates a great deal of Platonism. I mean,
Yes.
as far as the mainstream, like if we're talking about Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, they're soaked in Platonism. There's just
Right.
no way of getting around it. Whether it's Augustine or Philo of Alexandria, or all of the philosophers of the like Islamic Golden Age, um, you're getting Platonists and Aristotelians, of course. But then that brings up the discussion: is Aristotle a Platonist? And we
Hmm.
don't need to go down that road. But yeah, people turn towards the quote unquote mainstream religions because those have some of that essence
Yeah.
in them as well. And that's
Yeah.
what I think a lot of people end up calling the perennial tradition. What they're really referring to is Platonism,
Yeah.
that is kind of dormant within the main monotheistic religions.
Yeah.
And it's interesting too, because like a lot of people in the 70s, the 60s, they were turning to the East, like to India. And McKenna did not have good things to say about
Gurus. Yeah. He
about
did not like
gurus and
gurus.
about Hinduism and things like that. Like he called it a skin game, and thought that like if you spend enough time going, I think he spent a lot of time in Indonesia, and he was just like, nobody goes to the ashram with their knees quaking. He's like the thing about psychedelics is that like once you're in, you can't get out. You just have to
Hmm.
wait it out. And that doesn't happen with any of the religions where you're just like possessed by
Hmm.
this mystical fervor or this mania, to use the Platonic terms. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, like he didn't have good things to say about any organized religion in particular.
Right.
But I think that we're seeing a kind of return to that because the new age or new thought or these kind of alternative modes of spirituality were ultimately unsatisfying and did not solve the crisis of meaning,
Right.
the way people thought that it's like, oh, it's just make your own meaning. Okay.
Yeah.
It's like,
Or
all
just
right,
straight up
well, you
spiritual
can't just
bypassing.
make your
Yeah.
own meaning.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
like you can, but like you have to have other people agree with you in order to like get in on something to create something good, because otherwise like no man is an island and nobody can
Right.
just can nobody can build these kind of utopic visions of a future world alone. You can live in a little paracosm and hope to God that a barbarian doesn't come along and destroy it. But
Right.
you have to convince other people to see your way and to construct meaning intersubjectively and not just in your own between your own ears.
Yeah.
And so I think a lot of people, that's why they turn back to the main religions, because they have this critical mass of followers that, you know, maybe you can get them to agree on things. That's a debate for another time, but
Right.
um, all interesting things to discuss. And but I think that I've succeeded in demonstrating the extent to which Terence was practicing a kind of Platonism that was deracinated or separated from the Platonic tradition, but very much re-articulating these old ideas that had been around for quite some time, and he's adopting them to explain the psychedelic framework.
Yeah.
And I am very much influenced by that.
Me too.
By I was encountered, I think, Terence McKenna maybe in 2008, 2009, and then that's when I started getting involved with psychedelia in general, and gradually moved towards philosophy because I saw in philosophy ways of explaining what I had experienced.
Right.
Not perfectly, but certainly better than any other model
Yeah.
explains.
Yeah. And hopefully we've also succeeded in showing why these traditions like Platonism and Hermeticism are still so hugely valid and still provide at least some directionality and body of work to see other modes of expressing and exploring things like mystical states, altered states, and also present some answers to big questions that might be more satisfying than the ones we've been, spoon fed by mainstream spirituality and religion. And then that can circle back into all this other territory that we're just starting to hint at, and how deeply influenced um, Christian philosophy, Christian doctrine on the deeper levels is by these traditions. And you really got to dig to get to that stuff.
Mhm.
But that's where people like you come in, and you're just an endless portal to all of this stuff, man. So I thank you again for the work you're doing. I thank you for doing the show. And thanks for hanging out for so long, man. I really, really greatly enjoyed it.
I think it was a great chat, and
Yeah.
there was not a dull moment in the conversation. So
Likewise, man.
I'm glad that we had a successful talk, and I'd be happy to come on again and talk about something else.
Awesome, man. Awesome.